Hey, Mr. B, I was I just finished my write-up and I was thinking, well, this is kind of a long write-up and, Mr. Babcock, he's a busy guy and he doesn't really hear enough of my voice throughout the day. So I figured that instead of just sending you this long, boring document, I would instead put it into podcast form. So, maybe you can listen to this in the car or, well, you're a busy person. I imagine you'll be doing other things. Um, so I guess I'll just jump straight into it here with the summary slash internal factors. I've decided to combine these two sections because I find that you can't really summarize it without discussing the internal factors as a result. So, after the 1991 Ethiopian Civil War, the country had turned into a dominant state party. This means that one party wins every election by a large margin. Anyone can win against the party, but it is very rare that they are challenged. In this case, the party almost always wins by like 90% or so. The group that was in control was the People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or EPRDF. They're a political coalition of four parties, namely the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, they'll become important later, the Amhara Democratic Party, the Oromo Democratic Party, or the Southern Ethiopian People's Democratic Movement. They combined to make up the EPRDF, who overthrew the communist one-party state during the Civil War. In 1995, as a result of the Civil War, the EPRDF and their leader developed an ethnic federalist government, which sought to establish equality for all ethnic groups in Ethiopia. Ethnic federalism is a form of federal government which regions are defined and segregated by ethnic and using red line policies. For Ethiopia, this meant removing the old province system and replacing it with 10 regions and 2 charter cities. These regions are governed by a council whose members are directly elected and represent districts in similar fashion to like our current Canadian parliamentary system. It's actually quite similar to the parliamentary system. But on April 2nd of 2018, the once powerful Tigray People's Liberation Front, who had led the EPRDF with their prime minister for the past 27 years, was ousted from the federal government. During a closed-door election for the chair of EPRDF, executive committee members from the remaining parties voted in favor of Abiy Ahmed and defeated the TPLF. These are very significant implications, of course, because the TPLF members had been the leader for over 27 years, and whoever becomes the leader of the EPRDF will essentially become the prime minister, because they don't really stand a chance of losing an election. The TPLF didn't just lose the leadership, however, they were completely ousted from government and moved back to Tigray, where they continued ruling their region and occasionally clashed with the federal government on a much smaller scale. An example of this butting of heads would be when the regional administration of Tigray was reported to have defied the federal government and refused to allow Ethiopian federal police to arrest one of their members. His name was Getchu Asafa. Sorry, I pronounced that wrong. And that was just a small example of a small defiance, where they would protect party members who may have committed federal crimes. On December 1st of 2019, the now Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy, merged all of the parties in the EPRDF as well as some of the smaller parties in Ethiopia that had recently grown to prominence, to create the new Prosperity Party. The TPLF refused to join the Prosperity Party, citing that the new prime minister had become illegitimate because he had rescheduled the general elections. So this is a little bit interesting because historically elections are held both regionally and federally. They're like same ballot sort of thing. And they're set in May. They've been set in May since the first election. But the prime minister decided to postpone the election to August. So not a huge change, but this will become important later. This is the reason that the TPLF gave. However, it is likely that they wouldn't have joined the party anyways because they weren't particularly fond of Prime Minister Abiy for kicking them out of the party and all of government. On a constitutional level, if an election hasn't happened by at least October 5th, 2020, the House of Representatives, the Prime Minister, and the Council of Ministers will all become illegitimate. I think that it's like a 5-year plus sort of situation where you have 5 years to call an election. If there are some extenuating circumstances, then you were allotted, I believe, 6 months before your position becomes illegitimate. And of course, later on, due to the pandemic, the Ethiopian government was forced to postpone the election that was scheduled in August to an indeterminate time in 2021. We now know that it will be June 15th of 2021, but at the time they didn't know that. Either way, it would still be a constitutional violation. However, in the Constitution, there is extenuating circumstances, and this would definitely qualify. A global pandemic is definitely something they can excuse. Tigray responded to this postponement by just having an election on September 9th, even though it went directly against the wishes of the federal government. So they were having their federal election, and I believe they even put names on the ballots for they were having their regional election and even put names on the ballots for the federal election. But of course, not surprisingly, the TPLF won with 98.6% of the popular vote. This is partially because the TPLF is so popular, but also because the other political parties boycotted the election, which is pretty interesting. So Tigray now finds themselves in an awkward position of being the only region to have an election and go directly against the Ethiopian government, which at the time only increased tensions between a region and federal state. At this time, I would ask you to take a moment to look at one of the files I have attached, which is showing a map of Ethiopia. This map shows the Tigray region, which is of course located in the north. If you don't want to take a look at the map, maybe you're driving, I'll do an excellent job of explaining Ethiopia as a whole. So Ethiopia will primarily be looking at the north. The very top is the Tigray region. It borders to the right of the Afar region and is just below the Amhara region, which I believe is it is the second biggest region in Ethiopia. But just above Tigray is Eritrea, which is a country to the east of Africa and just above Ethiopia. And then, of course, Sudan is also a bordering country on Tigray, which will become slightly important later. But the main one to keep in mind is that Tigray does border Eritrea. All right. So, on January 27th, 2020, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, and Eritrean president, as well as the Somalian president, held something that is called a tripartite agreement. It's a meeting in which essentially the governments meet up and discuss peace within the regions. It was something that actually ended up winning Abiy a Nobel Peace Prize back in 2018 because tensions were so high between those three nations, which is pretty interesting considering what will happen in the future. These meetings strengthened each country's relationship economically, as well as working together to combat the ongoing drug smuggling rings. However, this particular meeting on the 27th was the countries working together to prepare for the upcoming Tigray war. By February, even some branches of Abiy's own government, primarily those left over from the TLF, who were representing Tigray, feared an Eritrean invasion. According to the former defense minister of Eritrea, a large number of Ethiopian forces had been moved into a base at the capital of Eritrea, as well as a base just on the border of Eritrea, which was inside Tigray. The former defense minister went on to say they were expecting to be like a hammer in the northern command and the anvil on the eastern side to strike out the existence of the TPLF. On June 17th, 2020, Debretsion Gebremichael, who was elected in that September election that was held illegally, stated that the federal government was threatening war against the Tigray region, and as a result, the TPLF began to dig trenches. In mid-October, the Ethiopian National Defense Force, as well as special forces from the Eritrean capital, moved to the border of Tigray to plan their attack. On November 2nd, now acting Tigray president Debretsion Gebremichael told journalists that the Ethiopian National Defense Force, or ENDF, planned to attack on Tigray. On November 4th, Tigray officially struck first with a surprise attack on the northern command of the ENDF in the capital city of Mekelle. Several people died in this conflict. TPLF forces rescued some weapons from Ethiopian bases and claimed that this was an act of self-defense. In my opinion, I think this is pretty fair considering the lead-up to this conflict. I imagine that if Tigray didn't strike first, that the federal government probably would have. On this same day, electricity, telephones, and internet services in Tigray were shut down by federal authorities. This, of course, meant video footage of many events from this time could not be uploaded to the internet, which is very important and will come into effect later. On November 6th, Ethiopia responded by launching a counter airstrike attack on Tigray forces. They destroyed many rockets and other weapons. In response, neighboring Sudan closed its borders, and the United Nations officially released a statement asking for a swift and peaceful resolution. A day later, Ethiopia made a political move by officially deeming Tigray's regional government as illegitimate and illegal. By November 9th, both Ethiopia and Tigray forces were launching airstrike attacks at each other, killing hundreds in the process. However, later that night on the 9th going into the 10th early in the morning, around 500 civilians were killed at the Miyakadra massacre. This is a city just on the border of Sudan, according to the Amnesty International. Witnesses say Tigray forces were responsible for the killings after suffering defeats from the federal government. However, a Tigray refugee claimed that it was Eritrean forces that were responsible for the massacre. By November 11th, nearly 1,000 refugees had crossed the border into Sudan, some TPLF soldiers. On November 14th, TPLF forces launched a rocket strike attack on Eritrean capital, saying that Ethiopian government forces were using its airport to carry out attacks on TPLF fighters. At the time, Eritrea was still denying that they had any involvement in the ongoing war, but it was becoming increasingly clear that this claim was very false. With the information we know now, it obviously was. At the time, it wasn't quite as obvious, but by November 23rd, Ethiopian forces had surrounded Tigray's city of Mekelle. The TPLF accused Abiy's government of invading their region and subjugating the population. TPLF claimed the government's troops had inflicted merciless damage on Tigrayans. The claim, of course, being that they weren't just going into the city capital and simply taking it over. They were also committing very violent acts, which could not be verified because any video footage could not be uploaded to the internet. And supposedly, this is all, of course, speculation, Ethiopian forces were quite diligent in their handling of video cameras to make sure not a lot of this was recorded. By the 26th, Prime Minister Abiy ordered the federal military forces to launch their attack on Mekelle, the capital of Tigray. This was one of the first battles of the Tigray War and was named the Mekelle Offensive. The main attack didn't actually take place until the 28th, when TPLF forces were forced to retreat after a bloody battle with at least 27 civilians killed and hundreds wounded. Tensions between South Sudan and Ethiopia increased after rumors that the Prime Minister of Tigray was hiding out there. The Tigray Prime Minister then came out with a statement a few days later saying that he wasn't going to back down and would continue to fight for Mekelle. He also claimed that he also attempted to flex his muscles by saying that Tigray was in possession of several rockets and they would not hesitate to launch them. In response, Abiy hosted his own press conference where he claimed that no civilians were killed during the assault on Mekelle. And 99% of the missiles launched by the NDF, which is the Ethiopian National Defense Force, hit their targets successfully. This claim is, of course, false because we know that at least 27 civilians died in the Mekelle massacre, on top of Eritrean forces, at the very least, extrajudicially killing 35 civilians during another attack on Tigray. In early December, residents in Mekelle began to loot and riot to protest the federal government's invasion. And recent announcements that they had captured or nearly captured every TPLF commander. So the people inside of Tigray were growing increasingly frustrated that the TPLF couldn't win, and they began to riot in their own ways. A few days later, the Ethiopian forces captured UN humanitarian force and ignored 2 military checkpoints. This would increase tensions between the UN and Ethiopia. On December 13th, Sudan and Ethiopia had come to an agreement to hold a summit of East African countries to discuss a resolution to stop the fighting. On December 15th, Ethiopian and Eritrean forces committed yet another massacre, this time at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. This time, 250 people were hiding inside of a church. They were taken out and shot in front of the town square and church. It was more execution style, supposedly. This was one of the bloodiest days in conflict. The newly formed transitional government of Tigray, that is primarily run by the Ethiopian government, took its place at the Tigray capital. So now the Ethiopian government has created a new government inside of Tigray to oppose the TPLF.
And because they have the capital, they are claiming to be more legitimate and control all of Tigray in theory. On December 16th, the fighting had reached some of the smaller cities surrounding Mekelle. During this time, if you had violated any of the curfews enforced by Eritrean and Ethiopian soldiers, you would face a physical beating in one town or be killed. In one town, over 200 people were killed, and the town was left destroyed. The Ethiopian government denied any involvement in the killings. At this point, the Tigray War was starting to feel less and less like a war and more like the Ethiopian government going from city to city in Tigray and killing Tigray soldiers and civilians. This is a killing of over 950 people within less than a couple weeks. Here, I'm going to bring up another picture here. I would ask you to go to the second picture provided in the document, and it's just a quick map showing what Tigray still controls up until this point. So everything in the yellow, as you can see, is held by the Ethiopian government. Anything in orange is still land that is up for dispute. We don't really know who controls it. It's still sort of a battleground area. And then the parts that are more of that transparent red color are held by the TPLF and other Tigray forces. So by January 6th, 2021, Tigrayan forces were still in control of the mountainous areas of Tigray. Fighting continued to take place in Mekelle, and the ENDF forces retreated from the rural positions. So all of those wars that were taking place, or all of those smaller battles that were taking place to the south and the west of Mekelle, the Ethiopian forces started to back off a little bit from those areas and retreat back to the capital. On January 9th, the TPLF had another massacre where they executed 300 refugees, according to a report by the European External Program with Africa. However, in this same report, other anonymous sources claimed that Eritrean forces massively killed their own civilians in refugee camps to punish them for leaving Eritrea and escaping their shoot-to-kill policy. So, of course, this is, at this point, a little bit of hearsay. The official report is going to blame the TPLF. However, there are other reports saying it is Eritrean forces that are killing its own people for trying to flee the country. I imagine one side is correct. It's not going to be a weird mix where they're both killing a total of 300 refugees. It's possible, but we don't know because the internet is still down in Tigray at this time, and there's no way to get reliable sources on this. In early November, another source said that the TPLF used the same base to execute 9 young Eritrean men in revenge for having lost a battle. So this is supposed to say that TPLF had killed in that area before, and they had executed people before, so it was likely that they would do it again. In my opinion, it also seems likely that the TPLF probably was the one doing the killing, considering Eritreans coming to Tigray doesn't seem like something the TPLF would be super happy about. I imagine they would think that they are spies of some sort, but it is entirely possible that it was Eritrean forces killing other Eritreans. The Ethiopian government finally declared a victory and said the main phase of war was over. However, we all know this is not true, and the TPLF still has control of over 40% of Tigray. So, through the remainder of January, February, and March, there was no major territory change from the map that I showed you earlier. The TPLF continued to have control over the mountainous areas in Tigray and continued to fight and take back the capital, unsuccessfully, however. The Ethiopian government and Eritrean government continued to hold many of the border cities into Tigray, so it was becoming increasingly difficult to enter Tigray. It was becoming a little bit of a circle, being circled in a little bit. Many number of deaths from soldiers is not disclosed because the war is still ongoing and each party doesn't really want to show their weaknesses. The numbers that we do know for sure is that in November, at least 550 TPLF soldiers were killed at the hands of the Ethiopian government. The TPLF has made a claim that they have killed a total of 100,000 Ethiopian and Eritrean forces. However, this is likely a very exaggerated number to show that they have that they are in control of the war. But we also know that at least 3 UN guards and 5 aid workers have been killed. 2 million have been internally displaced from their homes. 61,000 people have become refugees. 5.5 million are in need of aid, and 20,000 people are missing. So that could potentially allude to a total death tally if 20,000 people have gone completely missing. This war currently shows no sign of stopping, as even on April 1st, a video surfaced of Ethiopian troops executing 11 unarmed men before disposing of their bodies. This is a pretty clear sign that both Ethiopian forces and Tigray forces don't really seem like they are backing down, as Ethiopia is still going into Tigray cities and executing civilians and soldiers. All right, well, we got through that first section and summary. I hope that I did a pretty good job of explaining the whole conflict in general, but we are missing some things still. Some of the external factors and external pressures from different governments and bodies. So the very key and obvious international countries that are bordering Tigray play a pretty important role. As previously shown, the Eritrean government is clearly aligned with Ethiopia, even if they do not admit it in any way. The United Nations plays a very important role in this conflict. On December 2nd, the United Nations pled for the conflict to end peacefully and claimed that they would quickly gather humanitarian aid. On multiple occasions, the UN attempted to enter Tigray to visit refugee camps and had been shot at by both TPLF forces and Ethiopian forces. So the UN are not very welcome in Tigray, even if that aid is definitely needed. United Nations workers were often the first to break news because they were the only people that had successfully got into Tigray, so it quickly became the most reliable source of information instead of the hearsay that we got at the start of the war. In January 21st, the United Nations did a special representation on sexual violence and in conflict, and brought attention to sexual violence in the Tigray war. The UN had grown increasingly concerned about the amount of rape that had happened, as well as trading sex for basic survival commodities such as food, water, and shelter. This is a pretty clear and obvious issue that you're going to have in a bloody war such as this, where forces are going from city to city and capturing and destroying civilians' land. This is a logical step of that war, which is really sad to see. In early February, 53 international staff of the United Nations were now officially permitted to enter other areas of the Tigray region. Previously, they had been prohibited from entering certain areas, and they still are prohibited from entering other cities, but their access to certain areas has opened up. The United Nations Security Council, which we talked a little bit about in class, had scrapped plans to issue a statement calling for the end to violence in the Ethiopian Tigray region because of opposition from China and Russia. So we talked a little bit in class about how there are, there are 5 countries that can essentially veto anything that comes into the Security Council at any time. And in this case, China and Russia both hold that power. This would have been the UN taking in some way, would have been the UN taking the TPLF side and asking Ethiopian government to back down, and leave the country. But thanks to Russia and China, these important Security Council and their important Security Council seats, the UN can only wish for the war to end without taking sides, which is why you see them making statements such as, "It would please leave the country. Like please end the war peacefully, guys. We can work this out," instead of, "You need to leave Tigray. This is getting really really bad. We can sort out the diplomatic stuff later." Since then, the UN has condemned the mass murder on both sides, and there has been a lot of it, and wants to repair the relationships between Tigray and Ethiopia. In early November, at the very beginning of the war, the African Union created a peace and mediation proposals. The proposals would end the war in Tigray before it even really started. But Prime Minister Abiy did not approve, as it gave Tigray a little bit too much power. Tigray regional leaders continually ask for help from the African Union to make Abiy stop invading their country, or region, more specifically. And the African Union continually asks both sides to stop fighting. So they're doing their best not to take a side. But the TPLF is essentially begging the African Union to step in and say something. Other than condemning the acts, the African Union hasn't done anything particularly meaningful in any way. Unfortunately, they did their best when they had that proposal, but it seems as though the Ethiopian government isn't super on board for that. The European Union was actually initially supposed to give humanitarian aid to Tigray, but it was delayed. However, they eventually got their 4 million euros in emergency aid. This money was primarily used to help those that had fled to Sudan. So a large number of refugees had escaped from Tigray, I think 10,000. By the end, it was closer to 25,000 had fled from Tigray to Sudan. So a lot of that money will go to Sudan, to helping those Tigrayans in Sudan. Nearly every major world superpower has said they wanted to end the conflict as peacefully as possible. Most officials haven't officially taken a Tigray or Ethiopian side, but have instead just condemned the mass murders. In Canada, our Foreign Affairs Minister has called on both parties to restrain for a peaceful solution to protect civilians. China, of course, was one of those key Security Council seats who objected, and that shows that they're probably actually a little bit more favorable towards Ethiopia. The same goes for Russia. Although neither country has openly come out with a statement, in fact, neither has commented, it's pretty clear to see if that UN Security Council meeting passes, then Ethiopia would probably be forced to retreat or face some level of economic sanctions. The same also can be said about India. However, they don't have the same power to veto that Russia and China does. It is just a little bit interesting that they are showing their cards in support of Ethiopia to some extent. Obviously, these are more soft endorsements than, because no country has come out, or no country that has objected has come out in favor of Ethiopia. However, Kenya has openly come out in support of the Ethiopian government. The US has taken a very interesting position. Most countries, like the UK, have just called on Ethiopia specifically to de-escalate the violence, but the US has called on the TPLF to protect its civilians and take steps toward ending the war. To me personally, this is a very interesting way to phrase this statement. In my opinion, it does two things. It further legitimizes Tigray as its own place or region by the way that it says protect its civilians. And the phrase makes me think the US wants Tigray to take some control of its own independence in some way. It doesn't just want the new transitional Tigray government to rule over the people. The US has also, of course, condemned the many actions the TPLF has taken, mainly the rocket attacks, which is a little bit ironic from the US condemning airstrike attacks, but that story is for another day. There are many statements so far from the majority of players, but it will be interesting to see where it goes from here. This is definitely a step in the wrong direction for Ethiopia, the war in general. Just a couple years ago, Abiy had won a Nobel Peace Prize and was praised by many of these countries that are now forced to criticize him for massacring cities in Tigray. Resolution and future. Unfortunately, this war is still ongoing, and it doesn't seem to have an end in sight. As stated before, many countries and organizations have called for the end of the war, but neither side appears to be giving much ground. In my opinion, this war will end when Ethiopia decides it will. Between Ethiopia and Eritrea, they have way more troops than Tigray, and they can call on two nations to fight for them if things start to get bad. In comparison, Tigray only has a population of around 5 million, and they have a confirmed 23 battalion, which is definitely small in comparison to the Ethiopian National Defense, which has at least 100,000 people. In areas that Tigray currently holds, they're pretty environmentally advantageous, those mountainous areas, according to foreign policy experts. However, it would not be impossible for Ethiopia to finish them off if they are willing to risk losing a lot of troops doing so. Now it's time for my opinion. So, if you want my informed opinion that I've developed in around a week, it's a very difficult situation for the international community. In an ideal world, Russia and China would not have vetoed the Security Council vote, and the United Nations would have been able to put out some pressure to help move Ethiopia away from Tigray, and maybe from there they could have worked something out a little bit more diplomatically and not just going into towns and slaughtering people. However, I understand the situation is super complex. Both sides are committing pretty terrible acts of war, and Ethiopia before this conflict was like beginning to westernize. They had grown in global popularity. So I understand if you're a country, you don't really want to burn that bridge from a country that had moved from the previous communist government to the now more liberalized Prosperity Party, and before that, the coalition. So you don't really want to mess with that new flow that Ethiopia has going, but you also can't fully support Ethiopia because they're going into towns in Tigray and executing civilians on camera, and some of that footage is starting to come out. as a result of these factors, most countries have made small statements, like Canada, essentially saying that, killing people is bad and we shouldn't do that. But I can definitely empathize with the situation that some foreign countries are currently facing. It's a difficult one, to not really take a side. But if I had final say, I've done a lot of research. I'd say I'm pretty knowledgeable on this topic. I would say the international community should come together and pressure Ethiopia to pull their troops out of Tigray. This is step one, in my opinion. This is the thing that has to happen. What happens after this can be a little bit up for debate, but we can't just keep going and killing 600 or 700 people essentially any day we want to. This isn't sustainable for the country. It doesn't make Ethiopia look good at all, and it's obviously pretty horrible acts of war. This is one step to make the situation better, of course. It would save thousands of lives. This is pretty universally accepted. But the second step is going to be a lot more difficult. You basically have two options. You can either make Tigray a completely separate or an independent country, or in my opinion, you have two. These are the two options that I would go with, in my opinion. You can either make Tigray a completely separate and independent country, or you can do the option that I would probably prefer. I would say Tigray should be given slightly better representation at the federal level. I think it would be nice if the TPLF could rejoin the Prosperity Party. That would be pretty positive. You don't need to return the government to the TPLF like it was previously. I understand those good changes from Ethiopia in the last 5 years that have come from the new leadership of Prime Minister Abiy have been pretty positive, and the economy is doing a lot better, and global relations are doing a lot better. But you also just can't have an entire part of your country completely disenfranchised and feel like the federal government doesn't really represent them. And like I said earlier, the ideal world is the TPLF enters the Prosperity Party, and it seems like the pretty first logical step to achieve that goal, where Tigray has some representation in parliament again, while retaining current Prosperity Party leadership with Prime Minister Abiy, who seems to be doing generally pretty positive things up until this previous year. In final closing remarks, I wish the best for the civilians of Tigray and all those are being affected in this war. I understand it can be a very difficult time, not knowing when you're going to get humanitarian aid, not knowing if forces from either side are going to come into your city and destroy it and kill civilians. So I can only hope that this conflict ends in a peaceful manner, hopefully very soon. So, thanks for listening, Mr. B. I hope you enjoyed my Ethiopia-Tigray conflict analysis. I think I've decided I'm going to also send you the script to this. I think it's just if you get lost, you might need it, because there was a little bit of rambling here, and I hope that you enjoyed your time with me. You don't get to hear my voice enough, do you? You can't escape me. All right. Well, you have a nice day.